Have you ever felt a silence so deep it had a weight to it? The kind of quiet that isn't just an absence of noise, but a presence all its own, pressing in on you from all sides. It's a silence that builds in lonely places, in hearts that have sealed themselves off from the world. Today's story is about a man who lived in a silence like that, a fortress of quiet he built in the high, lonely mountains. He thought its walls were impenetrable. But he was about to learn that even the most desolate canyons can echo with life, and that sometimes, the most unexpected visitors carry the key to a door you forgot was ever there. The world outside his small cabin was a masterpiece of harsh beauty, a kingdom of granite and pine sculpted by wind and time. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of cold stone and the promise of snow. For Elias, this was not just a landscape, it was a sanctuary. He had come to this mountain 5 years ago, not to find something, but to lose himself. He had carried a grief so vast it felt like a second shadow, a constant companion that whispered in the rustle of leaves and sighed in the moan of the wind through the eaves of his hand-built cabin. His life was a rhythm of survival, a deliberate and unvarying ritual. Chop wood, check traps, patch the roof, clean his rifle. Each task was a stone laid upon the memory of what he'd lost, a wife whose laughter was like wind chimes, a son whose future had stretched no longer than 5 short years. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. A small, dust-covered rocking horse stood motionless in the corner, a monument to a life that wasn't. Elias moved through this space with a heavy grace, his face a mask carved from the same stoicism as the mountains around him. He rarely spoke, having no one to speak to, and his own voice had become a foreign sound. The solitude was a heavy blanket, and he had wrapped himself in it so tightly he could no longer remember the warmth of anything else. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue that morning, had begun to curdle. Great, bruised-looking clouds gathered at the peaks, rolling down the slopes like a dark tide. Elias had seen it coming. The mountain had its moods, and he had learned to read them like the pages of a book. This was not a mere squall, this was a true blizzard, a white beast that would swallow the world and hold it in its jaws for days. He pulled his thick coat tighter, the worn wool smelling of wood smoke and leather, and headed out for a final check of his trap lines. The wind was a physical force now, shrieking through the pines and tearing at his clothes. Snow, hard and granular, began to whip through the air, stinging his exposed cheeks. He moved with a practiced economy, his boots crunching a steady rhythm against the rapidly whitening ground. He was not afraid. The mountain had thrown its worst at him before, and he had always endured. Endurance was his specialty. It was near the last snare, tucked under the heavy boughs of an ancient fir tree, that he saw it. Not the dark fur of a fox or the grey shadow of a rabbit, but a small mound in the snow that didn't belong. It was a patch of deep, vibrant red against the stark white. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. As he drew closer, the mound shifted. A small head lifted, black hair dusted with snow, and a pair of dark, frightened eyes stared back at him. It was a child. Huddled beneath her was an even smaller form, completely shielded from the wind. 2 children. Apache, by the look of their buckskin clothes and the beadwork on the older girl's worn moccasins. They were miles from the reservation lands, lost and on the verge of being consumed by the storm. For the first time in 5 years, a feeling other than the dull ache of grief pierced through Elias's armor. It was a raw, fierce, and utterly unwelcome jolt of responsibility. He looked up at the raging sky, then down at the 2 small faces. Leaving them was a death sentence. But bringing them into his world, into his carefully constructed silence, felt like a different kind of death entirely. The journey back was a battle. The older girl, who could not have been more than 8, was weak but conscious, her eyes tracking his every move with a fierce, wary intelligence. The younger, perhaps 4 or 5, was a dead weight in his other arm, her small body limp with cold and exhaustion. He wrapped them both as best he could in his own coat, shielding them with his body against the gale. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, trying to rip them from his grasp, but Elias bent his head and pushed forward, his own warmth a desperate offering against the mountain's fury. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a haven of gold and shadow. He kicked the door shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the gentle hiss and pop of the fire. He laid the children down on the thick bare pelt before the hearth, his movement swift and sure. He stripped off their wet outer clothes and wrapped them in his driest wool blankets. The younger one, Shima, moaned softly but didn't wake. The older girl, Nita, sat up, pulling the blanket tight around her sister, her gaze never leaving Elias. It was not a look of gratitude. It was a look of challenge, of pure, undiluted suspicion. She was a small, cornered animal, ready to fight for the only thing she had left. Elias ignored her glare, his focus on the tasks at hand. He ladled warm broth from the pot simmering over the fire into 2 wooden bowls. He set one down near Nita, a silent offering. She stared at it, then at him, her small chin set in a stubborn line. He did not press, turning instead to the younger girl. He dipped a corner of a clean cloth in the warm liquid and gently moistened her lips. He worked with a deep, instinctual tenderness he thought had been buried long ago, a muscle memory from a different life. The cabin was filled with a new kind of tension. It was the silence of 3 heartbeats instead of 1, the air thick with fear, suspicion, and the ghosts that stirred in the firelight. That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat in his worn wooden chair, the rifle across his lap, and watched the fire dance. Outside, the blizzard raged, a tempest of white noise and raw power. Inside, a different storm was brewing. The sisters slept on the rug, Nita's arm thrown protectively over Shima, even in sleep. Their soft, rhythmic breathing was a sound the cabin had not known for half a decade. It was a sound that dismantled him, brick by silent brick. Each gentle exhale seemed to find the cracks in the fortress of his grief, whispering of small chests rising and falling in a cradle that now stood empty. He looked at them, their dark hair fanned out against the bearskin, and he saw not 2 strangers, but the specters of his own loss. He saw the curve of his wife Sarah's cheek in Nita's sleeping face. He saw the trusting smallness of his son, Leo, in Shima's curled form. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. He had invited life back into this tomb, and it was excruciating. When he opened his eyes, Nita was awake. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. Her dark eyes were wide with a different, more complex emotion. She had seen the flicker of agony on his face, the raw pain he kept so carefully hidden. She saw his ghosts. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the firelit space, a silent, mutual acknowledgement of a sorrow that needed no words. The barrier between them, the wall of fear and distrust, had not vanished, but a small, crucial stone had been dislodged. He was no longer just a strange, silent man. She was no longer just a lost child. They were 2 souls adrift in the same storm, recognizing the darkness in each other's eyes. The storm held them captive for another day. The world outside the single window was a churning vortex of white. Inside, the rhythm of their strange, temporary life began to settle. In the grey light of morning, Elias took a small block of pine and his whittling knife. He sat by the fire, the children watching him. His large, calloused hands, so used to the brutal work of an axe or the cold steel of a rifle, moved with surprising delicacy. Shavings fell away like snowflakes, and slowly, a shape began to emerge. A bird, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening for a song. He worked without looking up, pouring his concentration into the simple task, the repetitive motion a balm for his turbulent thoughts. When it was finished, smooth and perfect in its simplicity, he held it out to Shima. He said nothing. Her small hand, hesitant at first, reached out and took it. She turned the little bird over and over, her fingers tracing its wooden form. Then, a sound broke the cabin's heavy silence. A small, clear giggle. It was a sound so pure and unexpected that Elias felt his heart clench. It was like hearing a forgotten song from his childhood. Nita, seeing her sister's delight, allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch her own lips. Her gaze shifted to Elias, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something soft in her eyes, a fragile truce. Later, he made a thick stew from the last of his dried meat and vegetables. They ate together, huddled by the fire. The silence remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of solitude. It was a shared quiet, a space of communion, filled not with words, but with the clinking of spoons against wooden bowls, the crackle of the fire, and the silent, growing understanding between three people shipwrecked together in the heart of the winter. As the second night fell, a new sound threaded its way through the howl of the wind. It started as a low, mournful cry, far in the distance, but it grew steadily closer, multiplying. A wolf pack. They were hungry, emboldened by the storm, and they had caught the scent of the cabin, the scent of fire, of food, of life. The howls rose in a chorus, a primal song of hunger and the wild. Shima, startled from her sleep, began to cry, burying her face in her sister's side. Nita held her tight, her own body trembling, but her eyes were fixed on Elias. He rose slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, and took his rifle from its pegs on the wall. He checked the load, the metallic click echoing loudly in the tense room. He didn't look at the children. He walked to the heavy plank door and stood before it, a silent sentinel. He was a mountain of a man, silhouetted against the flickering firelight, the long rifle held loosely in his hands. In that moment, he was no longer just a man grieving in a cabin. He was a protector. A guardian. The howls grew more frantic, circling the small structure, the sounds of claws scrabbling at the logs. Elias remained perfectly still, a bulwark of quiet strength between the children and the snarling dark. He was defending more than just their lives, he was defending the fragile warmth that had begun to seep into the frozen corners of his own heart. Nita, watching him, seemed to understand. She gently shushed her sister, her own fear momentarily forgotten. She slid from the bearskin rug and moved to stand a few feet behind Elias, a small, dark shadow mimicking his resolute posture. They stood together, the large man and the small girl, a silent, unspoken alliance, waiting for the dawn. The dawn came as a whisper, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of lavender and rose. The storm had finally broken, its fury spent. The wolves, thwarted and cowardly in the light, had slunk back into the shadows of the forest. The world outside was reborn, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The silence that returned was profound, a sacred hush over the transformed landscape. Elias lowered his rifle. The immediate danger had passed. He went to the window, his breath misting the cold glass, and looked out. And he saw her. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, almost 100 yards away. It was a woman, tall and slender, wrapped in a deerskin cloak. Even at this distance, he could feel the intensity of her gaze. She held a longbow in one hand, an arrow narked but not drawn. She had been watching the cabin. Waiting. It was their mother. She must have tracked them through the impossible heart of the blizzard, a feat of skill and maternal desperation that defied belief. The tension in the cabin, which had just begun to recede, snapped back taut, sharp and cold as an icicle. Nita and Shima were awake, drawn to the window by the stillness in Elias. Nita gasped, a single, sharp intake of breath. "Ina," she whispered. The word was a prayer. Elias felt a complex wave of emotions, relief, for the children, regret, for the loss of his temporary purpose, and a primal, inexplicable fear of the woman who stood like a judgment at the edge of his world. She represented the world he had fled, the connections he had severed. She was here to reclaim her children, and to reclaim the silence he had so briefly lost. Elias unbarred the door. The cold, clean air rushed in, smelling of pine and frost. He stepped outside, onto the small porch, deliberately leaving the rifle behind. He stood with his hands open and empty at his sides, a gesture of peace. The woman, Anaba, began to walk towards him. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her feet making no sound on the deep snow. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, grief, and fierce resolve. Her eyes, dark and piercing, never left his. They were the same eyes as her daughter's, carrying the same wary intelligence, but honed by years of hardship. As she drew closer, the cabin door flew open and the two girls rushed past Elias, their small legs churning through the snow. "Ina!" The cry echoed in the vast stillness. The reunion was not loud or effusive. It was a desperate, silent clinging. Anaba knelt and gathered her daughters into her arms, burying her face in their hair, her body shaking with a relief so profound it was almost violent. Nita, her face pressed against her mother's shoulder, turned her head slightly. Her gaze met Elias's over her mother's back. It was a look that held 1,000 unspoken words: gratitude, fear, apology, and a deep, child's understanding of the man's hidden sorrow. Anaba eventually rose, her daughters clinging to her legs. Her eye swept over Elias, then to the cabin door, then back to her children. She saw their dry clothes, the faint smudges of stew on Shima's cheek, the way they stood close to this strange, large man without fear. She was reading the entire story of the past 2 days in those silent details. There was no accusation in her gaze, only a deep, penetrating assessment. She saw everything. Anaba looked from her children to the man, and then she turned and walked back toward the tree line where she had left a small, hydrap bundle. She retrieved it and returned, stopping a few feet from Elias. Her daughters watched, their small faces filled with curiosity. Without a word, Anaba knelt and unwrapped the bundle. Inside, folded with immense care, was a small blanket. It was woven from dyed wool and plant fibers, the colors rich and earthy. She stood and held it out to him. It was not a payment. Her posture, the solemn look on her face, made it clear this was something more. This was an offering, a gesture that transcended language and culture. Elias hesitated, then reached out and took it. The wool was soft and heavy in his hands. He slowly unfolded it. And his breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to fall away, the snow, the trees, the cold air all vanishing into a roar in his ears. The pattern woven into the center of the blanket was a single, perfect bluebird perched on a stylized mountain peak. It was the exact design his Sarah had been working on, the centerpiece of a baby blanket she was weaving for their son, Leo. He had the unfinished piece still, folded away in a small wooden chest, a painful relic of a future that had been stolen from them. But this blanket, the one in his hands, was complete. The pattern was finished. The threads were seamlessly integrated, as if the same hands had worked on it from start to finish. Hot, unfamiliar tears welled in Elias's eyes, blurring the image of the bird. He looked up at Anaba, 1,000 questions warring on his face. How? How could she possibly know? She simply held his gaze, her dark eyes filled with a deep, ancient wisdom. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an answer, but an affirmation. Some things did not need to be explained. They simply were. He watched them go. The mother and her 2 daughters, a small, resilient unit, moved back towards the trees, their figures shrinking against the vast white canvas of the mountain. They did not look back. They were returning to their world, and he to his. Elias stood on the porch for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, but he didn't feel it. In his hands, he clutched the blanket. It felt impossibly warm. He finally turned and went back inside the cabin. The silence was there to greet him, as it always was. But it was different now. The heavy, oppressive weight was gone. The air felt lighter. The quiet was no longer the sound of absence, but the soft, resonant hum of peace. He walked over to the corner where the little rocking horse stood, a silent accusation for 5 long years. He gently, tenderly draped the completed blanket over its wooden saddle. The bluebird seemed to take flight in the firelight. The unfinished story was now complete. The wound in his heart, a wound he thought would bleed forever, had been stitched closed by the hands of a stranger, by a gift that was more than a gift. It was an act of grace. It was a bridge. He stoked the fire, and the flames leaped up, bright and warm, casting a golden glow that filled the entire room, leaving no corner for the shadows to hide. The fortress had not been breached, its gate had simply been opened from the inside. And so, we leave him there, in the quiet warmth of his home, a man no longer lost in the silence, but simply listening to it. Because what he learned, and what we must remember, is that connection is the most powerful force on earth. It finds us even in the most desolate places. It speaks to us, not always in words, but in shared glances, in acts of courage, and in the simple, profound kindness of a stranger who sees our sorrow and offers us not pity, but a way to be whole again.